Good morning, everyone. This is Beyond the Binary, a community radio show here in Southern Illinois.
91.1 FM. Good morning.
Yes.
Good morning. Good morning. All right, welcome to Beyond the Binary. We're going to start our show off with a song by artist Mina Caputo. Do you want to say something while I set that up?
I love Mina Caputo. Mina Caputo, that's with an M. Mina Caputo is a transgender musician, singer. She's amazing. She started out as Keith Mina Caputo. Well, no, Keith Caputo, and now goes by Keith Mina Caputo, and she's absolutely amazing. I follow her on Facebook as well, and I just think she's brilliant. So here's her song Identity, and then we'll hit you up soon with a bunch of news stories going on and some more transgender discussion, of course. Thanks, guys. Alrighty, that was Mina Caputo, M-I-N-A
Caputo.
Caputo, C-A-P-U-T-O.
Absolutely.
That was her song Identity.
Yep. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. We have quite a few news stories to get through here, locally and globally, if you will. The first of which is a return to last week. I mentioned that Sheila Jeffries is releasing a book in October called Gender Hurts, a feminist analysis of transgenderism, and how there was pushback against the publisher Routledge from some trans activists and academics writing a letter suggesting that maybe they hold off or not publish the book. I don't really stand on this notion of not publishing work. I am vehemently anti-censorship, period. But nonetheless, it's a scary, I want to acknowledge, right, that the publication of that book is scary, knowing the track record of Sheila Jeffries and radical feminists who are transphobic, who need work like this because it helps kind of legitimate a base from which to stand and to legitimize transphobia, the complete erasure of trans identities, by framing all trans bodies as being, well, first off, very rarely do these radfem activist sorts tend to talk too much explicitly about trans men. They're really focused on trans women being men who are trying to infiltrate women's spaces, and that's where the transphobia kind of belongs. And they refer to trans scholarship as pseudoscience. And essentially, what's being called here is, I have something from the Trans Advocate. It's titled "The TERF Empire Declares War Against Trans People." TERF is an acronym, Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, is what this group is referring to them, right? So TERF is a relatively common term here. So that's what I mean when I say TERF. All right. So this was a letter written from what were being reframed as the TERF, but from an academic. And this was written to Trans Advocate, to the person who originally wrote the letter to Routledge. All right, here it is. I guess a trigger warning. I hesitate at those, but there's a lot of hate in this letter, so I'm going to put that out there. I am writing to let you know that we were all sent a copy of your recent letter to Routledge Press in reference to Sheila Jeffries' forthcoming book, Gender Hurts, and have organized a small but growing group to address the issue. We realize a corrective is urgently needed. We have held preliminary discussions to ensure that as academic women, we will confront the questions beginning in the fall semester 2013 and again in the spring semester 2014. So they're preparing for, essentially, the resistance from folks like me, for instance, or those who are going to critique this work, which is the way academia works. It's open criticism and debate. So this notion that they're already preparing for the criticism, well, I mean, that's good. It also suggests a healthy kind of academic back and forth, too. Except that the healthy part kind of goes somewhere else here. We recognize the telltale signs of a dangerous movement that feigns legitimacy in postmodern pseudoscience and meaningless jargon. You catching my cis drift? We will continue to coordinate our efforts so that our classrooms will be at the forefront of questioning transgender as a valid political movement. Or perhaps that is just a veil for misogynist hate group. Ellipses, I cut some out here, and it goes on. Students, after they sift through the death and rape threats sent by transgender activists to women and feminists, will understand why the syllabi are not posted online or on the blackboards, and our decision to procure text from other than usual sources will make clear sense to them. Because the regular spaces would be peer-reviewed, meaning that people like myself would review these articles before they go to publication. So they're suggesting that their research has to go somewhere else. And finally, the last kind of bit that I want to read from the letter is the following. In the classroom, the first order of the day will confront the ever-ubiquitous, overused, manipulative claim of, quote, transphobia, end quote, which sounds hollow when students see that the primary victims are natal women who happen to hold opinions and write things that you and others do not happen to like. The letter is ultimately signed, Sincerely Women for Academic Freedom, and then it's just a series of initials and the states that they come from. So we don't know exactly who these individuals are. But Women for Academic Freedom, which is the opposite of academic freedom, but hey, what have you.
Right. It's definitely frightening.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean,
there's not. Is there? I don't feel like there is even a lot of academia out there focusing on trans women as.
Well, it's increasing, right? It's increasing.
It is.
I mean, but the specific vein that they're coming from is a very particular vein of scholarship that questions the legitimacy of trans women in the first place.
Right.
And that goes back to the 80s.
You know what kills me
80s,
about...
I believe.
I mean, that was hilarious that they said, catch my cis drift.
Well, they're using that language as a term because they refuse to acknowledge words like cis or transphobia.
As being...
See, what essentially TERF feminists, what are being called TERF feminists here, transphobia, cis-sexism, all of this stuff, right? Cis supremacy, this doesn't exist. All that there is patriarchy or not.
No,
sexism
really,
or not.
I feel like upholding the binary like that is just... It just works against everyone.
Well, yes, I think that for you and me, and I think to some of our listeners, I think that a lot of us kind of see that. But, this is also the foundational premise that these individuals operate from. And so a body like yours or a body like mine, or the thought that I write about, for instance, is going to really challenge and destabilize their opinions. Unfortunately, letters like this one end up coming out as these ad hominem attacks on the integrity of the individual as opposed to actual arguments. Yeah. And beginning with the notion that anything trans is pseudoscience already proclaims what your position is, and that is that anything trans is already pseudo or fake. Right? Like they've already answered their question. There's no academia in there. There's no desire to want to learn. There's no desire to even want to open dialogue because the suspicion is always on what they're calling natal, they refer to natal men dressed as women.
Right.
And that's a problem. So I want to put that out there, and I know that this dialogue will continue to unfold, and I will continue to talk about it. Let's go ahead and move on. Talk to us about some genes, will ya? Some genes.
And not the kind that you get from your family.
No, different kind. Well, maybe they were passed down.
Maybe. These are genes that you wear, and the title is... the title of this article is If You Wear Jeans, You're Not a Woman. Transphobia at Women's Shelters. Of course, this is going on, the hopeful understanding that trans women are women, not like Sheila feels. Okay, this is kind of something that we've been going over for a while now. We've been going over shelters, the New Chicago shelter for trans women in specific, and this is one of the reasons why we have these shelters for trans women in specific, because we have cases like this. This is out of the women's shelter in Maine. Women who complained said they believed in at least one case it was ruse. They believe one of the people in question that was there in the shelter is a man who occasionally dresses as a woman to get into the shelter, perhaps for voyeuristic reasons. That person did not have any feminine mannerisms and often dresses in a t-shirt and jeans, sporting a 5 o'clock shadow of male facial hair, they said. If they're really living as a woman, and I quote, I think they have every right to be there, said one of the women who complained. But he wasn't wearing makeup or wearing eyeliner or anything, just a man wearing a skirt. It was just odd, they said. So, of course, they're holding the same standards, held against other biological women. Yeah. To trans women, and okay, the problem is kind of recognized in this article where they kind of compare trans women to someone like Lady Gaga.
Out of makeup, right?
Who's out of makeup. There's a picture here of her out of makeup, and They talk about privilege here. They say, nobody questions or doubts the very genders of cisgender women who wear skirts and jeans or don't put on makeup.
Right.
And it's unique treatment that is reserved for us trans women.
Right.
We thus face the dichotomy that we must be either far more exaggeratedly, stereotypically feminine than is expected of other women, or risk being treated as men.
Which is exactly, brings us back to the first article, that that's exactly the logic that's being upheld by folks like Sheila Jeffries and the TERF academics.
This is an instance of cis sexism, the attitude that cis people's genders are more real, more important, and generally superior to those of trans people.
Yeah, it's that simple.
It's that simple. And I mean, that's why it's great to see shelters like the one in Chicago, but it's so upsetting that while we have that shelter, this kind of problem kind of just is still going to be ongoing.
Yeah,
in places
nationally
like
so.
So
particularly when shelters rely on these binary understandings of who's allowed in their doors.
Right. So you made a great point. Anyway, we have a 2011 survey kind of going over certain statistics. Of 6,450 trans Americans, 22% of trans women reported experiencing domestic violence due to being trans. 19% of respondents had been homeless at some point in their lives, a number which rose to 48% among those who had suffered domestic violence. So, I mean, we can see a reason why trans people, specifically, it seems in this case, trans women, are going to want to access these shelters.
Yeah.
34% of trans women who had attempted to access shelters were denied entry outright. Of the respondents who did manage to access a shelter, 25% were evicted after it became known that they were trans. 55% were harassed by shelter staff or residents, and 29% of trans women were physically assaulted. 26% were sexually assaulted in shelters. Overall, 47% were treated so poorly that they chose to leave the shelter themselves. That's horrible.
Yeah, it's awful.
It's so awful. So, I mean, this is happening over at the shelter in Maine.
Yeah. Well, and it happens in a number of shelters, and I think that that's something to also, whenever we have any of these news stories that are, out there somewhere else, we want to make sure that we always acknowledge that this happens everywhere.
This happens everywhere.
And maybe it'd be advantageous and efficacious for us to maybe get someone from the Women's Center here, the Women's Shelter, maybe come talk about what sorts of resources are available, maybe what they're doing to help. Because I know that they have really led in a lot of educating in the community around trans people. So
we've been there ourselves.
Yeah.
I think I want to start wearing jeans more, because I primarily wear skirts and dresses.
Yeah.
It makes me want to start,
For sure.
reacting that way. Okay,
All right.
Anyway.
So our next story here comes from all the way from California. This is posted on the Transgender Law Center. Federal government resolves complaint filed by California trans student. This was posted on July 24th. The U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights and the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division announced a resolution to a complaint, basically, that was filed on behalf of a trans student in California's Arcadia's Unified School District. Here it is. So the resolution requires the school district to treat the student as male in all respects and keep his transgender status private. Remember, we were talking before about young people who come into these kind of spaces that become legal battles and how their identities kind of maybe ruin their youngness or the youthfulness that you have a hard time with. This is an example of a student whose identity was kept private, as well as the family. And so the public does not have access to who this particular individual is in the Arcadia Unified School District.
That's important for me.
But essentially, the school district agreed to revise its policies to ensure that all students who do not conform to sex stereotypes, including trans students, have equal access and opportunity to participate in all of the district's activities and programs.
Wow.
And this comes after a series of experiences documented by this student, particularly where there was an overnight field trip that he was to participate in. And because the school didn't know what to do with him, they didn't put him in a girl or a boy sleeping space. They made him sleep by himself.
What?
Quarantined from everybody else. And
this happens a lot to trans people.
Yeah.
Trans people get isolated as the fix.
Yeah. And that's exactly what happened. So it looks like there's some move going on there, some more federal recognition as well.
This is so, oh my gosh.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and talk about, sizeism, fatness here. You have that article over there.
Okay. All right. Well, this is definitely, kind of a body politic way of turning this discussion, where a woman had transitioned into a man, and this article is titled "Male Privilege and Transitioning from a Fat Woman to a Fat Man." So we're talking right now about male privilege, but as well as, really discussing the difference between men and women as far as two fat people being treated very differently.
Yeah.
When it comes to, whether it's just everyday misogyny and the standards of beauty. So anyway, let me go over the article in specific.
Yeah.
This person says, "I am a fat man. Once I was perceived to be a fat woman. As soon as I started passing as a man, I found I was treated with a respect that wasn't often given to me as a woman. My personal space and boundaries were no longer violated. I was no longer talked down to, and people suddenly respected my right to privacy and my right to be left alone. I was no longer treated as if I simply existed for men's pleasure. My body was no longer overtly criticized. Fat women are disproportionately targeted in Western society. They are subjected to public humiliation and discrimination every day simply because of their bodies." Now, we're not saying, or we're not trying to assert that, I'm hoping this article isn't trying to assert that this doesn't happen to men as well. But the privilege definitely...
Well, he specifically says it's not that it doesn't happen to him, it's that it's different.
Right.
And that the difference is stark enough that he realizes that when he was perceived to be a woman, that it was public ridicule and there was no one standing up to stop it. Whereas when he became to be read as a man, for instance, as a fat man in this instance, that the ridicule wasn't ridicule in the same way about you're doing it wrong. It's about... it became more socially acceptable. People stepped out of his way.
Yeah, it's like the man has more agency over his body.
Yeah. So I mean, I just think that's something really interesting to consider about...
Okay, you know what, she actually...
Oh, go ahead.
Excuse me. She actually does talk about the relativity of this. She says, or he says, "Occasionally I still face discrimination as a fat man, but it's not... it's not as vehement, societally sanctioned, nor pervasive as it once was. My treatment has changed simply because of the way that society perceives my gender. This is male privilege in action. We live in a society that has built a whole industry on bullying women for not being what is considered attractive enough to men. Think about that the next time you want to stare at a fat woman on the bus." I think this is great.
Yeah.
Because we have this man who's talking about his now acquired male privilege.
Absolutely.
I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
So this article is really important. I really like what's being said here, and I like that he's actually discussing this, and because this is a perspective that a lot of men don't really get to experience is understanding how misogyny operates through a transition. I think it's the special perspective of a trans person,
Now, we want to make an interesting turn here to some religious leaders, two religious leaders that are interesting. I wish I had some pipe organs to play in the background. We need to start working on some special effects like that, because I think that would be really useful here. Yeah. So the first person I want to turn to is Pope Francis. Yes, the Pope. Dun, dun, dun. I don't know what that is. Pope Francis. So this is something very interesting. This was just posted yesterday. Pope Francis reached out to gays on Monday, saying he won't judge priests for their sexual orientation in a remarkably open and wide-ranging news conference as he returned from his first foreign trip. Quote, "If someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge?" What? Francis asked. "We shouldn't marginalize people for this. They must be integrated into society." It's very interesting. It doesn't really...
That was the frickin' Pope.
Yeah, that was, yes, absolutely. The Pope had just said that, and that's a huge, interesting take. He's certainly advocating for assimilation and integration of gays into this system. Yeah. But it's very interesting, this kind of shift that's going on, and I'll say it's huge. This is huge for the Pope to say something like that in general. And there seems to be some interesting new things out of this new Pope, particularly in his young papacy. Yes, I just apparently said that. Freudian slip there. Anyway, the Pope. That's one particular take. And while it's something interesting to talk about gay men, I think that kind of signals maybe a shift that's going on. Now, when we talk about gay bodies or gay identity, lesbian, bisexual, that, in our opinion here, is not mutually exclusive from trans identities. And so we do not see those as being at odds. We do believe that they tend to play back and forth. And so this is why we will also sometimes specifically report on these. Because when we talk about gay men, it's interesting because then the questions of, well, what about a trans man who identifies as gay? Will the Pope still hold the same type of legitimacy towards that type, or is there a different type of unique sin?
Now, all of this is very much relevant.
Yes, and and this brings us to our next religious leader, good old Pat Robertson, televangelist Pat Robertson, recently said something about trans people that might be surprising to some of you if you haven't heard it yet. Pat Robertson is one of the many people in the world, if you will, televangelist who does things like blames natural disasters on homosexuality.
He's that one.
Oh, he's one of the many.
He's one of those.
He's the one who really leads this kind of like weird view of the world and does so interestingly. So I'm going to go and play a quick clip here of Pat Robertson saying something.
Fabulous.
This is David, who says, I work with two people who have decided that they are females. I know what the Bible says about homosexuality. On to refer to them as females since they've had their gender status changed in the eyes of the law. Why would you have to refer to them as females?
I don't understand all that.
Because they are?
I think there are men who are in a woman's body. It's very rare, but it's true, or women who are in men's bodies. And they want a sex change. And that is a very permanent thing. Believe me, when you have certain body parts amputated and you have shot up with various kinds of hormones, it's a radical procedure. I don't think there's any sin associated with that. I don't condemn somebody for doing that. But somebody who just says, well, I'm really a woman, I question the validity of that statement. But they say they're counted as female. You don't count somebody as female unless they really are, or male unless they really are.
In this instance, so this is the person who works with two people, so he doesn't really know their intentions or know their personal medical scenario.
It's not for you to decide or to judge. All right.
What? What?
Oh, it's good to have Pat Robertson on our side.
Except not really.
No.
So there's a lot of things that happened in that little blip there.
Yeah.
For one thing, I love that he says, trust me, when you have something amputated, it's permanent. Like, are you telling us something?
Oh my gosh.
Maybe Pat Robertson is trans.
No.
Yeah. What if? What if? What if, Arya? What if?
Oh goodness.
Yeah. Maybe he's been working on the inside all along. Huh? Okay, maybe not.
This is pretty crazy, though.
Yeah, it's interesting. So for him, so there's that one thing, this notion that apparently we're supposed to trust him. The second thing is that around 18 seconds to the end there, he definitely burps on air, which I thought was funny. Totally a side note there. And then the third point, yeah, absolutely.
Because I didn't notice that at all.
Oh, it's hilarious. When you watch the video, he's like, and then continues, and I go, huh. And then the third point is this notion that apparently Pat Robertson has the ability to condemn or not condemn bodies.
Sure.
Which to his listeners gives them the somehow right to justify their own condemnation of different types of bodies out in the world. So we have the Pope who's now saying, let's not condemn gays. Now we have Pat Robertson who's saying, well, maybe trans people aren't exactly sinful. Of course, Pat Robertson is also drawing on a certain logic that kind of defines trans people. A, that one needs to have SRS or gender confirmation surgery or sex reassignment surgery or hormone replacement therapy. So which also suggests that maybe, because then he goes on this whole rage about like, well, who am I to be able to, like, I basically need access to health records, like as though the doctor needs to be the one that defines that for me.
It's pretty fascinating, though, that he's in general being sensitive to what a trans person is going through, or not. Maybe,
I mean, kind of like a certain type of trans
not. I
person.
wouldn't say sensitive, but just kind of recognizing the validity and actually,
Sure, yeah.
the transition of the body for those who choose that route.
Absolutely.
as being a way that actually makes them feel more at home in their bodies.
Yeah.
So I found that to be sort of comforting to hear, which is strange because I've never been comforted by anything that man has said. But it's interesting. It's like having, you know, it's kind of scary too, because it's like having someone that you considered really horrible kind of come up to you and sort of graze your shoulder a little bit.
Oh, wow, that was kind of creepy.
Well, I mean, it is creepy, but this is all creepy. It's very strange.
Fair enough.
It's very strange, and it's suspicious, and it's like, why should I care what this man says at all, ever? So, I mean, it's strange having someone who's been so hateful kind of come up and say something a little sweet. It's like, I don't know if I want to take that candy.
Well, here we are at the 30-minute mark. We're going to take a quick break.
I'm a writer. That's a metaphor.
That's a metaphor. We're going to take a quick break. A song by Billy Tipton, who is the late jazz musician, trans man who lived as a man, always arguing back and forth as to whether he was a butch lesbian trans man, nonetheless lived his life as a man up until his death in 1989. So this jazz song is Sweet Georgia Brown, and we will be right back after that song and a few messages.
Welcome back. This is Beyond the Binary on WDBX Radio 91.1 FM. This is Benny and Aria.
Well, I mean, technically, you're Aria and I'm Benny, just to be clear. You're not both of us.
Oh, that's true. Well, thanks for pointing that out. I don't want to confuse anyone.
You're welcome.
It's raining outside. It's very dismal and rainy. But, you know, just that aside, I thought I'd do some small talk on the radio. It saddens me. I'm not a huge fan of the rain. Apparently, I'm really funny this morning.
Yeah,
okay.
Small talk.
Alrighty.
Speaking of small talk, what's going on in Russia?
Okay. This is horrible. What's going on in Russia? Okay. If you haven't been paying attention, you should be. Like, it's really scary actually what's going on over in Russia right now. There's a lot of pictures that have been popping up of horrible things happening to queer people over there. LGBTQ boycott could pressure Russians. As Vancouver Pride Week kicks off, the LGBTQ community is expanding its boycott to all Russian products in protest of anti-gay laws in Russia. One expert says the community has enough consumer clout to actually make Russian politicians listen. It's horrible, actually, what's going on. Frightening. I mean, if you go there, even from here, if you take a plane over there and you're suspected of being queer, you can be arrested on the spot. So, I mean, that's just bizarre, don't you think?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is a slew of anti-queer legislation that's been signed into law. They're anti-homosexual propaganda laws is how they're being framed. And so anything that kind of promotes what the Russian government is calling basically homosexual propaganda, which of course is defined in many ways. This particular context refers to it as homosexual. And so how does this particularly pertain potentially to trans, what we might call as trans bodies?
Well, if they don't validate the trans body, then we are simply...
Well, yes, right. So if that body's not, validated as trans, it could be seen as being, if it's a trans person in a heterosexual relationship, and they're not perceived to be trans, but rather maybe a cross-dresser, for instance, then that relationship could be rendered null and void, and therefore promulgating homosexual propaganda. And so what's going on is this protest against Stoli, the vodka Stoli, which has been an LGBT or a sponsor of large LGBT events, corporate sponsor. And so these corporate pride events are kind of putting in this kind of consumer clout, saying that if we protest this Russian company, which will be in Russia, I believe, in 2014, it's being bought out or traded over or what have you, that it's somehow going to make the companies talk for them, which, in my opinion, essentially just kind of supports the notion that corporations are people, and therefore the corporation can speak for the people. And I don't like that type of activism, personally. It makes me think, why put the hands in a corporate sponsor to make that work happen? particularly as Americans, whether it be Canadian Pride is being reported here, or U.S. American queer organizations that are making these decisions on behalf of Russians, versus trying to engage with and talk to Russian LGBT organizations and asking what it is that they need and want from us. They've not had a voice in this, and there are LGBT organizations in Russia that haven't, right to my knowledge, they've not put anything out there asking for these types of boycotts. This is something that's being taken over by those with the money here in the West.
Yeah, totally agreed there.
So that yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I say look this up and stuff. Look up what's going on. Get in the know, of course, of what's going on in Russia. But the pictures that you'll see are really kind of gory. They're heartbreaking. They're hard to look at.
They really are.
They really are. Okay, so here's a quote out of the article that I'm staring at right now. The recent dreadful actions taken by the Russian government limiting the rights of the LGBT community and the passionate reaction of the community have prompted me to write this letter to you. I want to stress that Stoli firmly opposes such attitude and actions. Indeed, as a company that encourages transparency and fairness, we are upset and angry. Sorry, I don't know if I can pronounce this. Stoli.
It's Stoli. Just Stoli.
Okay, I'll just say Stoli. Stoli Vodka has always been and continues to be a fervent supporter and friend to the LGBT community. We also thank the community for having adopted Stoli as their vodka of preference.
And that's the person in charge of Stoli's company writing a letter that's really just saying, please continue to give us your money. We have nothing to do with this.
Yeah, and they actually have one of the pictures in this article, which it's just so frightening to look at. It's really not.
So it's something to keep an eye on. We're not, as a radio show, whatever clout Ari and I have at Beyond the Binary, we're not saying to or to not boycott. We're just questioning what that accomplishes. We understand, acknowledge that it's symbolic. But for me, I struggle through wondering is this what the LGBT organizations in Russia want? Is this something that's going to immediately help them? Does this make it harder for them? We don't know. And so that's something really to kind of consider when we kind of just say, let's boycott. I want to hesitate on what that means. So let's go into the next one here. This is an intersectional kind of analysis of a recent Supreme Court ruling on adoptive girl versus baby girl. Or I'm sorry, adoptive couple versus baby girl. And for those that don't know, this was a Supreme Court ruling that came out the same week that DOMA was overturned, as well as Prop 8. And the voter rights laws, all of that happened, and smaller Supreme Court cases like this one, which are huge in terms of Native American sovereignty, are anything but small, but they end up getting overshadowed by these other kinds of Supreme Court rulings. So this is an interesting way that a blog posting essentially on Transgender Law Center that was posted by a guest poster, Ryan, who talks about kind of the intersections of adoptive couple versus baby girl and the way that the Supreme Court, Baby Veronica is the name of the little girl in this particular ruling, and I'll talk about that in a second. But Ryan writes, the Baby Veronica ruling so vividly highlights the Roberts, that's the Chief Justice, court's deep investment in white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and heterosexism, and a coercive binary gender system. In short, he writes that if given the opportunity, the High Court will construe legislation to serve its own institutionalized interests in spite of the law's intent. Generally, issues of tribal sovereignty, or the ability for tribal governments to make their own rules and be ruled by them, receive very little press. And this is where this particular ruling comes in. So I kind of want to go back historically real quick. This particular case essentially says that a Native girl who was adopted by a white family gets to stay with the white family, and the Native father, who is Cherokee, does not have any rights to that child. It's all muddled in terms of the focus becomes on him as an individual, as a, quote, failure as a father, as opposed to what the rulings historically this is. There's a history of Native babies being adopted and taken from Native households and from tribes and given to white families. And this is part of a larger historical process, not just about Baby Veronica, not just about this father, but that's how the press, and this is how the ruling comes out, as an individualistic fault of the father. So going back, the Indian Child Welfare Act in the Supreme Court's, the ICWA is what it is, It was enacted in 1978, and it was Congress's response to the widespread epidemic of Indian children being separated from their parents and families based upon unsubstantiated presumptions of social irresponsibility that was made by social workers and judges who were ignorant of Indian culture and tradition. So they were just describing Western ideas of what good family looks like. For an Indian child in Wisconsin, for example, the risk of being separated from his or her family was nearly 1,600% greater than it was for a non-Indian child. And so essentially what this particular poster is doing is, blogger, I should say, is he's posting and talking about how these types of rulings that come out of Judge Roberts' court individualize issues that pull the individual, in this case baby Veronica and her father, away from the larger trajectories of legal histories that the court in the past was trying to rectify, right? He writes, the purpose of the ICWA was not to prevent the breakup of the Indian family, like here. Rather, it was to preserve the relationship between an Indian child and his or her tribe. It is the Indian tribe's interest, as well as the child's, which is separate and distinct from the parents, to ensure that the child maintains a connection to its tribe and extended family. So what this is really saying intersectionally is that when trans people, for instance, or gay people or people of color go against the court, it becomes these cases that are individualized to the extent that the rulings have nothing to do with the histories of racism, white supremacy, cissexism, patriarchy, homophobia, and that's what needs to be really prominent in these cases, is what they're arguing for. So baby Veronica should not be just about this one little girl and this one father, but about a history of Indian children and families being ripped apart and tribes being torn apart by a white supremacist federal court system.
Wow, okay.
So it's a very interesting blog posting. I really appreciate this one. We posted it, I believe, a few days ago. We'll repost this on our Facebook, facebook.com/beyondthebinary. Yes. I believe you're up next with Jamaica.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so what's going on over there right now is,
Jamaica.
This is from the Huffington Post, Gay Voices in Jamaica. Dwayne Jones, cross-dressing Jamaican teen, allegedly chopped and stabbed to death by a mob. You know, that's not something you really want to hear to start your day, but this is pretty tragic news what's happening over here. A cross-dressing teen was allegedly chopped and stabbed to death by a mob in Jamaica earlier this week. Dwayne Jones, a gender non-conforming 17-year-old. He was dressed as a woman and was dancing with a male when another female attendee told a group of partiers that Jones was actually a man. The report notes, one of the men went up to Jones and groped him, discovering he was male. Okay, wow. Yeah. This is... Oh my gosh.
And to be sure, there's an editor's note here that the reason why male pronouns are being used is because the way it's being reported is...
that this person's a cross-dresser.
Right, but we don't know if this person is a cross-dresser or a trans woman. That's the thing. And so they're just acknowledging that right now, what we have access to is that the language being used is as a drag queen. So for our listeners who are saying, why aren't we calling her a her? We don't know how she identified or how he identified.
We have no idea.
Yeah.
Male pronouns are being used, though. No one tried to defend Jones, a Paradise Row resident who dressed in drag, calling himself Gully Queen. Oh my gosh. So Jamaica's anti-sodomy law makes gay sex illegal and punishable up to 10 years in prison. So we also have that kind of on top of this stabbing. Arbitrary detention, mob attacks, stabbings, and targeted shootings. Gang rapes, genital mutilation, vandalism, threats, and intimidation.
Yeah.
So these are JFlag reported various human rights abuses that are being reported against gay individuals.
Yeah, or trans people.
So I mean, there's just this overall lack of you could say mercy for anybody who is LGBT. With these anti-sodomy laws, gay men are said to be hesitant to report them out of fear for their safety. So even if they are being abused or attacked or whatever, they're afraid to even look for help.
Well, they can't, because if you end up going for help, then you end up being potentially arrested and harassed even by the authorities.
Yeah, if you're identifying anything other than as heterosexual.
Now, this is a really good example of how colonization continues to persist in post-colonial spaces like Jamaica after being colonized for so long. these rules in all sorts of post-colonial spaces are laws that were enacted while being colonized by Western European powers that historically have burned, maimed, killed, raped gender non-conforming people, including homosexuality, usually under what are called buggery laws. So the laws of buggery, which is essentially homosexuality, gender non-conformity. All of these things kind of get truncated into the notion of you're not right or well, and so we're going to kill it out of you or beat it out of you or incarcerate it out of you. And so one thing I want to say is while this is happening in Jamaica, we have to be careful and note that this is part of larger histories that we are in the West inherently responsible for. And for us just to blame Jamaica and quote a backwards way of life is not true. This is what we as Westerners have given to these continents, and it's therefore our responsibility to listen to what locals like JFLAG is asking from us,
right.
Which largely involves
That's
our
good
just
reflexivity
being.
There.
It largely revolves, or what JFLAG tends to want is for us to dialogue about these things, to be aware that this is going on in Jamaica as they work towards changing these laws. It's nothing like in Russia that we're just going to boycott it, right? Because we don't have access to things. Jamaica's already an awfully harmed place. There were some boycott calls that say we should no longer, as gays, if you will, vacation in Jamaica. Well, first off, folks like Ari and I do not have the money to vacation anywhere, including Jamaica. But second to that, it's also the idea that post-colonial spaces like Jamaica have resort spaces where travelers are on one side of an island and residents are on the other. And it's to residents that these types of things happen to, not to the tourists who are bringing the money in, and then the money is then outsourced to countries that have resorts on these spaces. So Jamaica itself is still a post-colonial mess in many ways. They're really, as a country, as a nation, trying to pull themselves up, if you will, with what little resources they have access to because of those legacies. So.
In the past year alone, there have been at least 9 homophobia and transphobia-based murders in Jamaica.
Now, we only have about 9 minutes, so we're going to rush through a couple articles real quick, because I think these are still important here. First is to Ireland, keeping it global, if you will. The trans government launched a draft legislation in Ireland regarding gender recognition for trans people, which the trans community there has been waiting years to see. Now, this is the interesting part. Joan Burton, Minister for Social Protection, launched the draft legislation with little to no consultation from LGBT organizations. In fact, not a single trans rights activist knew about the launch last Wednesday. Very interesting what's going on in Ireland there. It's interesting because some of the legislation still requires like these old, like for instance, you have to be 18 or over to change your gender. If you're married and you are trans, you have to divorce before you can change your sex. Like it's these old, ridiculous laws that are taking place. That's something to be aware of in Ireland that's taking place. You have something there before I get to, this is kind of, actually I'll start with this here, this news story more locally about the hunger.
Let's do it.
Okay,
yeah,
it's going to be connected to what you have. So there's a California prison hunger strike is going on, for those who don't know, because it's really good. News in prisons is hard to get out. And so there's a prison hunger strike going out, and TGI Justice announces support. And I want to read their letter real quick in support of the California hunger strike. And the California hunger strike has been led by a noted white supremacist who has been in solitary confinement, along with leaders from a black organization, a Latin organization, and another organization within the prisons. I can't remember off the hand, and I wish I had their names, and unfortunately I forgot to jot all these organization names down. But essentially they have unionized as a group, and this white supremacist leader has won many legal battles because he's got his degree, his law degree, while in prison. For instance, his legal battles with the court system as a prisoner has ensured that prisoners can request books in their library to read, as well as to gain interest on the money that they make while in prison. So here's the announcement from TGI Justice. TGI Justice stands in solidarity with the mass hunger strike action inside of the California prison system that started earlier this month. As an organization of trans, gender nonconforming, and intersex people, or TGI, both inside and out of prisons and jails, we support the demands to end long-term solitary confinement, abolish debriefing, change gang validation criteria, end group punishment, provide educational, vocational, and self-help programs, and to provide adequate, nutritious food. There are women locked up in many of California's men's prisons and men locked up in many of women's prisons, along with gender non-conforming folks and intersex people caught in the bind of binary administrative violence. TGI people are in the dehumanizing facilities alongside strikers, participating in the strike, experiencing the firm foot of increased repression along with everybody else inside. Additionally, as TGI people, we are all too familiar with the common practice here in California and across the country to put TGI people into solitary confinement units under the logic of protection from the general population. In our hearts, we know that true justice and actual safety come from accountable and strong communities. For this reason, too, we know that working in coalition with non-TGI and straight, gay, or lesbian people to improve the conditions of and to end the existence of these torture units is in our own personal best interest, as well as our broadest collective best interest. They kind of go on about applauding the strikers and continuing that. So TGI Justice makes a public stand in support of the hunger strike taking place in the California prisons. I myself, Benny, am also lending that continued support to those strikers, particularly how it intersects with trans bodies. And then you have something here that brings us back to our discussion about Orange is the New Black show and Laverne Cox.
Yeah, somewhat. I'm holding a diagram right now, and this diagram illustrates how over-policing and profiling of low-income people and of trans and gender non-conforming people intersect, producing a far higher risk than average of imprisonment, police harassment, and violence for low-income trans people. So we can see how this relates to a show like Orange is the New Black, as we're all watching this happen to Laverne Cox herself. Laverne Cox. So what we have here is the comparison of criminalization of poor and homeless people and the criminalization of trans people, and just showing and comparing what goes on, leading to low-income trans people are exposed to arrest, police harassment, incarceration, and violence far more than the average person. Yeah. Trans people suffer additional gender-related harms while in custody of the criminal justice system. They're isolated and subjected to increased sexual violence, harassment, and abuse at the hands of prisoners and corrections facility staff. They're denied access to hormones and other trans-specific health care while incarcerated, forced to change gendered characteristics of appearance in prison, made to cut hair, give up prosthetics, clothing. This results in mental anguish and increased exposure to harassment and violence because appearance may conform even less to gender identity. Gender-segregated arrest procedures, searches, holding cells, policies, and procedures, etc. do not accommodate trans people. Low-income trans people are especially targeted due to lack of access to health care that would help them pass as non-trans people, as well as surgical procedures, and are commonly misclassified by arresting officers as male or female based on their appearance or whether they've had genital surgery. So of course this compares, or this kind of brings up the discussion of Orange is the New Black. We see Laverne Cox going through a lot of the stuff that I've read, but a lot of it seems to be definitely idealized.
Yeah, so that's that. I mean, we bring this up because while it's nice and we want to applaud that Orange is the New Black features a trans woman performing as a trans woman on a show, particularly a trans woman of color, that we want to also be careful not to romanticize the notion that this is how easy it is for trans women, or trans men as well in prison, and that this particular treatment it's nice and all, but there's also a hard, cold reality that's tracked constantly about the ways in which TGI, transgender, non-conforming, and intersex people are treated behind bars specifically.
I mean, it's a show for entertainment, but I definitely don't feel like the representation is as realistic as what queer people are really facing in these prisons. Okay.
Well, we've reached the end of our time today. Thank you for tuning in to Beyond the Binary. You can catch us on Facebook.com/Beyond the Binary. You can email us at bthebradio@gmail.com. We're going to leave you with a spoken word poem called The Here Poem. Have a great week, everyone.